I never thought it would happen to me, and I know every guy says that, but I mean it in the way a man might say he never thought lightning would strike his fishing rod while he was knee-deep in the lake holding a ham sandwich and thinking about mortgage payments. It is that kind of disbelief, the kind that comes not from ignorance but from stubborn faith in the world working the way you think it should. And for 6 years it did. 6 good years with Katia. Now Katia had this way of walking into a room like she had secrets and the confidence to carry every one of them in the curve of her smile. She was smart, but not the kind of smart that needed proving. She had that graceful intelligence that made people want to agree with her even when they didn't understand her. Our friends called us the perfect couple, and I never bothered to correct them because for a while we were. There were road trips and lazy Sundays and a shared love for documentaries about ancient civilizations. There was laughter in our kitchen and silence that felt like a warm coat rather than a locked door. But that silence changed. It started small, like the difference between sunrise and full daylight. She took her phone to the bathroom. She used to leave it on the couch buried under a blanket or left charging by the nightstand. Now it was always with her like a second skin. She stayed late at work even when I knew the office didn't have enough going on to keep a janitor busy past 6. And the way she looked at me, well, it wasn't the look of love or even of annoyance. It was the kind of look you give someone who asks if you remember them from high school and you don't. I didn't scream. I didn't accuse. Maybe because I didn't want to hear the lie, or maybe because I wasn't ready to accept the truth. So instead I did what any man who still has some self-respect but no peace of mind might do. I set a trap. I told her I had a 2-day business trip in Tallahassee. In reality, I booked a room 5 minutes away from home with a minibar stocked like I was planning a bachelor party for one and a view of a parking lot that held no mysteries. I checked in that morning with a duffel bag filled mostly with snacks and anxiety and waited until sunset. When the sky turned the color of old copper, I checked out without fanfare and drove back to my house. Her car was there. Not unusual. But next to it was a gray Audi I didn't recognize. Not the kind of car you borrow from a coworker or a cousin. This was polished and intentional, the way cologne is on a man who doesn't believe in coincidences. The house was quiet. No TV, no music. Just silence and a smell in the air that didn't belong to me. Candle maybe. Or arrogance. I unlocked the front door quietly like I was trying not to wake a sleeping child or a sleeping conscience. I stepped inside and there was a coat on the hook I didn't own and a pair of shoes too big to be Katia's and too stylish to be mine. The bedroom door was half closed. I pushed it open like I already knew what was behind it because I did. And there she was. And there he was. And everything we built came down without sound like a building made of pillows and secrets. She didn't scream. She didn't even cover herself with a sheet. She looked at me with the same expression she might use for a disappointing coffee order, and then she looked away like I was no longer something to focus on. And that's when it hit me. Not the pain. Not yet. But the truth that had been living behind my ribs for weeks. The love was gone. It had died quietly a long time ago, and I'd been dragging the corpse around like a sentimental fool, pretending not to notice the smell. I stood in that doorway longer than any man should stand in a place he's no longer welcome, and I stared at the back of a woman I used to know so well I could predict her sneeze from 2 rooms away. And the man beside her didn't flinch, didn't scramble for pants or apologies. He just lay there with the calm of a guy who'd already parked in someone else's spot and figured the ticket wasn't coming. There's a silence between 3 people in a room like that that you don't hear. You feel it pressing down on your skin like humidity on a summer afternoon. Heavy, hot, and full of everything that should have been said years ago. I didn't yell. Maybe I should have. I didn't throw anything or threaten anyone. I just nodded like I'd solved a riddle I never wanted to answer and turned around. I closed the bedroom door behind me, not to give them privacy, but to give myself a second of dignity before I walked back through my own house like a guest at someone else's barbecue. Everything looked the same. The photos on the wall still smiled like nothing had changed. Our wedding picture still hung above the fireplace like some kind of cruel joke. Her smile in that photo was the same smile she gave when she convinced me we were forever. I sat down on the couch and looked at the living room like I was trying to remember why I ever loved this place. There were blankets folded neatly on the armrest and a bowl of stale popcorn from last night's movie I watched alone. I didn't cry. I didn't even blink hard. I just sat there waiting for something inside me to break loud enough for the neighbors to hear. She came out maybe 20 minutes later, maybe a lifetime, and stood by the hallway with her arms crossed like the one offended. I looked at her and she looked everywhere but me, and for the first time in our entire relationship she had nothing to say. No excuse. No performance. Just silence and shame fighting for room on her face. "Why?" I finally asked, and she shrugged. Not the kind of shrug that means I don't know, but the kind that means I don't care enough to explain. That shrug hit harder than any fist could have. "I think we've been done for a while," she said finally, her voice so flat it might have been automated. I nodded. That part one already knew. I just hadn't been ready to admit it. Love doesn't die with fireworks. It dies when you stop noticing someone's laugh or when their texts start feeling like chores. It dies when date nights become something you postpone until you forget to reschedule them. And maybe it had died years ago. I just kept watering the grave. She asked if I wanted to talk. I said no. There was nothing left to say that wouldn't be a rerun of an argument we never had. We skipped the fight and went straight to the credits. She offered to stay at a hotel. I told her I'd already paid for one. She didn't ask why or how long I'd known. That told me everything. I grabbed my bag from the hallway, the same one I'd packed with hopeful lies about business trips and trust, and I walked out. I didn't slam the door because slamming doors is for people who want to be heard. I just closed it behind me gently, like you do when you're leaving something you loved behind because the memory is already painful enough. The hotel was exactly what I needed. Cheap, clean, and empty. The air conditioner rattled like it was trying to keep me company. I lay on the bed fully clothed, staring at the ceiling, wondering how many other men had found themselves in a room like this after a night like that. Probably more than I wanted to believe. I thought about calling someone. A friend. My brother. But what would I say? That my wife had taken our 6 years and handed them over to some guy with better hair and worse morals? No, that wasn't my style. I wasn't about to become the sad story someone told at a barbecue. Instead, I pulled out my phone and deleted her contact. Not because I hated her, but because I needed to stop reaching for someone who wasn't reaching back. The first night alone after something like that is quiet in all the wrong ways. But I made it through. And by morning something strange happened. I felt lighter. Not free. Not healed. But lighter. And I knew this wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning of something else. I woke up the next morning in a bed that didn't know my shape, and for the first time in 6 years, I didn't check my phone to see if she'd texted, because I already knew she hadn't. The air in that room was stale, and the window faced a brick wall like even the universe didn't want to give me a view just yet. I showered in a bathroom that smelled like hotel soap and forgotten dreams, and I stared at myself in the mirror with that quiet suspicion a man gets when he realizes he's been wearing someone else's story for too long. The version of me that had laughed at her bad jokes and folded her laundry just the way she liked it didn't belong here anymore. That guy had packed his things when he saw a gray Audi in his driveway and hadn't looked back. The new me, or whatever was left of the old me, needed something else. Not revenge. Not drama. Just clarity. So I went home. Not to confront. Not to argue. I just needed to see what was left. The house was quiet. No Audi this time. Just her car parked like nothing had changed. I walked through the front door with the same key I used the night before and let it click behind me like punctuation at the end of a sentence I didn't write. She was in the kitchen pretending to make tea, or maybe actually making tea for once. She looked up, and there was that moment that always comes after someone gets caught where they try to read your face and decide how much to lie. But I gave her nothing. No rage. No questions. Just a nod that said, I know, and I'm not here for your version of the story. I didn't expect you back so soon, she said like we were talking about groceries. I looked around the room. It still smelled like her shampoo and the candles she only lit when company was over. Everything was clean, too clean, like she'd spent the night scrubbing guilt off the countertops. I walked to the living room where our photo still hung and stared at it until she got uncomfortable. You can stay here if you want, she offered. I'll go to my sister's for a few days. Her sister lived in Arizona and hadn't spoken to her in months, so I knew that was a lie. But I didn't care. I wasn't interested in where she'd be. I was only interested in what she'd already done. No, I said. You stay. I'll figure something out. She nodded. Not out of kindness. Just convenience. She was always better at transitions than I was. I packed a bag slowly. Not because I needed much, but because every shirt I folded was a memory. The one from our trip to Asheville. The one she said brought out my eyes. The one I wore the day I proposed. They all felt heavy in my hands like fabric soaked in questions I didn't want to ask. Before I left, I walked into our bedroom one last time. She had changed the sheets. The bed was made. Neat lines. No trace of what had happened the night before except the scent of unfamiliar cologne clinging to the corners of the room like smoke after a fire. I didn't take everything. Just what I needed. A few clothes. My books. My guitar. I left the rest because I didn't want reminders. And because I figured she'd need to be surrounded by the ruins of what she'd built. When I got back to the hotel, the clerk gave me a look like he'd seen this movie before. Maybe he had. Maybe men like me were regular guests after all. I went back to the same room and sat in the same chair and stared at the same wall and realized that something inside me had shifted. Not broken. Just rerouted. The next few days passed like that. Quiet. Routine. I went to work. Came back to the hotel. Ate bad takeout and thought about better times. I didn't call anyone. I didn't tell my friends. Not yet. I wasn't ready to explain why the man who always showed up to game night with a smile now looked like he was searching for something under every couch cushion. But that silence gave me space. Space to remember the things I liked before her. Space to feel something besides confusion. Space to stop asking myself what I did wrong and start wondering what I wanted to do next. And one night, while I was flipping through old photos on my phone trying to decide whether to delete them or just bury them in a folder I'd never open again, I saw it. A screenshot. One I didn't remember taking. It was a message from her. Dated about 6 months ago. Staying late at work again. Don't wait up. Love you. But the timestamp didn't match the calendar invite I'd made for her birthday dinner. The one she never showed up to. That was the night I ate cake alone. That was the night I should have known. And that was the moment I realized the lie had been growing for a long time. It didn't start with the Audi. It didn't even start with the locked phone. It started the moment she stopped being proud to be mine and started rehearsing her exit behind a smile. But now I saw it. And I was ready to decide what came next. You'd be surprised how long a man can sit with himself when the world around him has gone quiet, not the kind of quiet that comes with peace or rest, but the kind that hums beneath your skin and tells you something has ended and the dust hasn't even begun to settle yet. I spent my days like a man adrift, going to work, coming back to the hotel, and trying not to let the walls close in while pretending that every conversation I had with my coworkers didn't feel like an audition for a role I'd already lost. Nobody knew. I didn't tell them. Not because I was ashamed, but because I didn't know how to make the words sound like anything but a confession I hadn't rehearsed. I avoided the house not because I couldn't face her, but because I didn't want to see the furniture arranged just so like our life hadn't been kicked over and trampled by the same boots she probably helped that man untie. But I still thought about it constantly, about what I'd seen and what I hadn't seen and the 100 little details that now made sense only in reverse. Like the way she stopped asking me to fix the kitchen light and started doing everything herself like she was practicing independence. Like the way she kept saying she needed more space and I gave it to her thinking I was being generous when really I was just giving her room to build a runway out of our marriage. I tried to piece together the timeline not because it mattered but because a man needs to know when he stopped being loved and started being tolerated. I remembered her laughter changing pitch sometime in February, becoming higher, tighter, like a woman who was smiling through a secret. I remembered how she started keeping a separate keychain for her car and house key, like she was preparing for 2 lives that could no longer share one set of keys. I thought about driving to her work once or twice, not to confront her, but to see what kind of life she was crafting when she wasn't pretending to live mine. But I didn't. I figured I'd done enough watching. Instead, I focused on the things I could control, which mostly meant finding a new apartment and figuring out how to cook for one without becoming a man who eats cereal for dinner every night. Then one night, as I was packing up my things from the hotel, ready to move into a small rental with creaky floors and questionable plumbing, she called me. It was late, just after midnight, and her name lit up my screen like a flare in a field of ashes. I almost let it ring. Almost. But curiosity is a strange kind of hunger, and I was starving for answers even if I didn't trust the source. "Hey," she said, her voice soft like the beginning of a song that never finishes. I said nothing. "I'm sorry," she added. I still said nothing. "I don't know what I was thinking," she continued. I guess I thought we drifted apart, but now that you're really gone it feels different. I wanted to laugh. Not the kind of laugh that comes with humor, but the bitter kind that starts in your chest and dies in your throat before it ever reaches your mouth. Do you love him? I asked finally because the question had been sitting in the center of my chest like a brick on a bookshelf. There was silence. Then, no. I thought I did. But I don't. That's not the same as loving me. I know. We sat there in that shared quiet, the kind that used to feel comfortable and now felt like standing in an empty parking lot after a storm. I miss you, she whispered. I miss who we were, I said. But that doesn't mean I miss you. She didn't respond, and I could feel her trying to find something to say, something that would undo the damage, with words that came too late. I don't want to lose you, she said finally. You already did. That was the last time we spoke for a while. I moved into my new place the next day, a small apartment above a dry cleaner with windows that overlooked the alley and a radiator that sounded like it was coughing up secrets. But it was mine. Every scuff on the floor, every dent in the wall, every creak in the floorboards was mine, and for the first time in months I felt like I could breathe. I bought a new coffee maker. I hung pictures that had nothing to do with memories we shared. I even started playing guitar again, something I hadn't done in years because she said the sound gave her headaches. Now I played until my fingers hurt and no one told me to stop. And somewhere in that silence, somewhere between the morning coffee and the late-night strumming, I started to feel something I hadn't felt since the day I stood in that doorway. I started to feel okay. Not happy. Not yet. But something close. There's something strange about rebuilding a life from the rubble of a promise that once felt indestructible, because it's not the absence of the other person that feels loud, it's the absence of the version of yourself that used to believe in them without hesitation. The mornings became rituals again, not shared routines, not scrambled eggs for two or mugs passed over a sleepy smile, but rituals made in solitude and silence, the kind that teach you who you really are when no one else is watching. I started walking before sunrise, not for exercise but for clarity, because there's something honest about a city waking up before it remembers how to lie. I'd pass corner stores where the same old man flipped the same closed sign to open each day like it was a sacred duty, and I'd nod at joggers who looked like they were running from ghosts they hadn't named yet. The sidewalks didn't ask me how I was doing, and the wind didn't care what I'd lost. There was a comfort in that indifference. I didn't think about her every day. Some days I went hours without seeing her, in the corner of my mind, adjusting her earrings or checking her reflection in a window that no longer held room for both of us. But then I'd hear a laugh in a crowd that sounded like hers, or smell her perfume on a stranger's coat, and it would all come rushing back, not like a wave but like a whisper, reminding me that love leaves traces even after the house is empty. And then came the letter. Folded twice, tucked neatly into an envelope that had no return address and smelled faintly of the cologne I never wore. It was waiting on my doorstep when I came back from one of those early morning walks, like a message left by a ghost who hadn't quite finished haunting me. I opened it slowly, expecting nothing but finding something else entirely. Inside was a single sentence written in her handwriting, the kind I used to trace in birthday cards and grocery lists and love notes she'd leave on the fridge when we still believed forever was real. You were always better than I deserved. No signature. No explanation. Just that one line staring back at me like a confession or a dare. I read it once. Then again. Then a third time, just to make sure I wasn't imagining the sincerity in the curves of the letters. I folded it back up and placed it in the drawer next to my keys, where I keep things that don't quite belong but are too important to throw away. Later that week, I ran into an old friend. The kind of friend you lose in marriage and rediscover in recovery. We grabbed lunch at a quiet place on the edge of town, and he asked how I was doing with that tone people use when they want the truth but will settle for a lie if it's easier to swallow. I told him the truth. At least part of it. I told him I was figuring things out. That some mornings were better than others. That silence doesn't scare me like it used to. He nodded and didn't offer advice, and that silence between us felt like friendship in its purest form. Then he said something that stayed with me longer than I expected. She didn't break you, man. She just revealed the cracks. I didn't respond. I just sat with that thought until it wrapped around me like a blanket made from the threads of something I hadn't wanted to unravel. That night I opened a notebook and started writing again. Not poetry. Not declarations. Just thoughts. Questions. Fragments of the man I used to be and pieces of the man I was becoming. I didn't know if it meant anything, but it felt good to see something on the page that wasn't silence. A few days later, I got another letter. This one wasn't handwritten. It was from her lawyer. She wanted to talk. Not about us. About the house. Apparently she was ready to sell. I laughed when I read it. Not because it was funny, but because it confirmed what I'd known all along. She was always better at endings than beginnings. Selling the house was supposed to be the final step, the administrative clean cut that turned years of whispered dreams and weekend painting projects into a transaction with signatures and closing costs, but when I walked through the front door for the first time in weeks, it didn't feel like closure, it felt like walking into a museum dedicated to a version of myself that no longer existed. The couch still had the indentation from my side, the one I claimed every night, with a bowl of popcorn and a commentary about whatever documentary she half-watched while scrolling through her phone and pretending to listen. She was already there when I arrived, sitting at the kitchen table where we used to plan vacations we never took and talk about kids we never had, and she looked up at me like I was someone she used to know but couldn't quite place. She wore that same blue cardigan she used to call her comfort armor, and for a brief moment I wondered if she'd worn it on purpose as some kind of peace offering or apology in fabric form. But I didn't ask and she didn't explain. "I talked to the realtor," she said without looking at me. "He thinks we'll get a good offer if we stage it right." "Sounds fine," I replied, because I couldn't bring myself to say more than what was necessary. There was a silence between us that felt less like tension and more like resignation, like two people waiting for the last train home, knowing it's already late and the platform is cold. We walked through the house room by room, checking for anything worth saving, and I watched her eyes flick over every wall like she was erasing memories with each blink. In the bedroom, she paused by the dresser. "You left this," she said, holding up a tie I hadn't worn since the last wedding we attended together. I took it and didn't thank her. Not out of spite, but because gratitude felt misplaced in that moment, like clapping at the end of a funeral. Back in the living room, she picked up the framed photo of our anniversary trip to the coast, the one where we'd stood on a cliff and smiled like people who still believed they were on the same page in the same book of the same story. She handed it to me, but I shook my head. Let her keep it. Let her remember the lie if she needed to. "Do you ever think about what went wrong?" she asked suddenly, and I could hear the weight behind it, not curiosity, not accusation, just the exhausted ache of someone searching for an answer that might let her sleep at night. "All the time," I said. "But not in the way you think." She nodded slowly, like she understood, like maybe she'd started asking the same questions and getting answers she didn't like. I didn't tell her that I knew about the first lie, not the Audi in the driveway, but the text on my birthday, or the way her phone always face down, or how she never laughed the same after she met him. I didn't tell her because I wasn't there for justice or apologies. I was there to end it. The realtor showed up 20 minutes later, all smiles and confident footsteps, and he walked through the place like he already saw the dollar signs floating above the countertops. I let him talk while I looked out the window at the street where we used to walk on summer evenings, holding melting ice cream and each other's hands and believing those simple moments were enough. The staging took 2 hours, and when it was done, the house didn't look like ours anymore. It looked like a catalog spread from a life neither of us had lived. Polished pillows. Neutral artwork. No signs of the couple who argued over paint swatches or danced in their socks on hardwood floors when the bills were finally paid. She stayed behind when I left. I didn't ask why. Maybe she wanted one last night in the shell of a story she'd broken. Maybe she wanted to remember what it felt like to be someone's wife before she became someone's regret. On the way out, I paused at the front door and looked back one last time. There's no real ceremony for endings. No bell that rings or curtain that drops. Just a door that closes quietly behind you. And a man who walks away without looking back. The house sold faster than expected, which seemed fitting because endings tend to happen that way, not with the slow unraveling you anticipate, but with a snap, a signature, and a wire transfer that turns memories into equity. The check cleared on a Thursday morning, and by Friday afternoon, I was sitting in my new apartment surrounded by cardboard boxes and silence that no longer felt heavy. Just honest. I didn't call her to tell her it was done. The realtor handled that. I didn't need to hear her say goodbye again or tell me she hoped I was doing well or that she still cared in some vague, non-committal way that made her feel better about the choices she'd made. I had nothing left to give her and nothing left to take. Whatever needed to be said had already been buried in the foundation of a house we no longer owned. But the strangest thing about moving on is how ordinary it feels once you stop pretending it should hurt forever. I started sleeping better. I stopped checking her social media. I even threw away the letters she sent me in those early days after I left. The ones filled with apologies that felt like receipts for a purchase I never agreed to. They sat in a drawer for weeks unopened just in case I needed proof that she'd been sorry. But I never did. Because sorry doesn't fix the shape of the wound. It just names it. One night about a month later, I was walking home from a late shift. Just me, a quiet street, and the sound of my boots on pavement. And I passed a little cafe I'd never noticed before. The kind of place that looked like it sold overpriced coffee and undercooked philosophy. But something about the way the lights glowed from inside made me pause. So I walked in. Not for coffee. Just curiosity. A woman sat at the corner table alone with a paperback and a mug that steamed like it knew secrets. She looked up when the door opened and gave me a smile that didn't ask for anything and didn't owe me anything either. Just a stranger's smile. Kind. Easy. Honest. I nodded. She nodded back. And that was it. I didn't sit down. I didn't strike up conversation. I just stood there for a moment in the warmth of that place, thinking about how life sometimes gives you small glimpses of what could be. Not to tempt you, but to remind you that endings aren't the same as finality. Outside, the wind had picked up and the streetlights flickered in that old familiar rhythm, and I kept walking. Not toward anything in particular. Just away from everything I used to be. Sometimes people ask me if I ever ran into her again. Truth is, I didn't. Not because I avoided her. Because I didn't have to. I'd seen everything I needed to see the night I opened that bedroom door and watched the last illusion die without ceremony or grace. And if I ever do see her again in a grocery store or across a crowded street, I won't wave. I won't scowl. I won't even speak. I'll just keep walking with that quiet confidence that comes when you've survived the worst part of someone else's story and finally started writing your own. Because love can lie. But freedom always tells the truth. And I finally learned how to listen.